And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is, after all, what we call race. And what are the impacts of this system? Well, racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, and when we think or talk about racism at all, that's usually where we go. We understand the unfair disadvantage, but it doesn't take very long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country. It's quite difficult. And for those of you who you're just like, oh my God, did she go there? I want you to come back for a minute, because the second story that I'm going to tell you is going to help us understand how we can even talk about those issues. But even as we recognize that we have a system that's either unfairly disadvantaging or unfairly advantaging individuals and communities, racism is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. I don't have time to give you many examples of that. Part of it is how we don't invest in the vigorous, excellent public education of all of our kids, because the blinders of racism make us believe that there's no genius in the barrios or in the ghettos or on the reservations. Part of it is how those same blinders make us complacent with the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system. Many examples of that. But for you who are healers, for you who are our newest crop, if you will, of physicians, it's important to understand how racism turns into health outcomes. And to understand that, I would like us to think about three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. I'm going to define these for you. I'm going to give you quick examples and then share my gardener's tale. Are you with me? Okay? So institutionalized racism is actually the hardest level of racism for many people to see, because in this nation we are so ahistorical, and we have such a narrow focus on the individual, and we have such a belief in meritocracy, right? These are some of the barriers for people to even see institutionalized racism. But what institutionalized racism is that system that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. That is the kind of racism that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator. That's the kind of racism that's been institutionalized in our laws and structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. That's the kind of racism that turns into inherited disadvantage, or its reciprocal inherited advantage. And we see it in terms of material conditions and access to power. And when you talk about differential access to quality housing, or equal educational opportunities, equal income, access to medical facilities and the like, these are all examples of institutionalized racism. And it's most important to recognize two things: that institutionalized racism explains why we see an association between so-called race and social class in this country, and that institutionalized racism can be both through acts of doing and acts of not doing, acts of commission and acts of omission, and very often institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. That's what most people think of when they hear the word racism. It includes the different idea of the prejudice, and then the different action, the discrimination. And for health providers, it can even turn into a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options. Because as a physician, you might think, well, that patient couldn't understand, or couldn't afford, or wouldn't comply, or whatever. And it can also turn into, blatant stuff like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's medical history. Important to understand on the personally mediated racism is that it does not have to be intentional. It can be unintentional as well. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I define from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races as acceptance of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. And it turns into self-destructive health behaviors, it turns into self-devaluation, it turns into the white man's Isis Holder syndrome, deeply believing that if I had lemonade, I would want to go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. But enough on the levels. What about the story? So, I'm going to first tell you, because this story was sparked by something I saw with my own real eyes. So I'm going to tell you about a story in my life. Then we're going to make it a story about racism. So my husband and I, newly married after residency, so if you guys aren't married yet, you know, keep your eyes open. Newly married after residency, we moved back to Baltimore. I'm going to finish my PhD at Hopkins, and we bought our first freestanding house. A cute little house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all over the porch. And we bought the house in October, weren't thinking about planting in those flower boxes. With winter coming, but when spring came, we were ready. We'd run out with our marigold seeds, and we see that some of the boxes have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. So my husband very dutifully goes down to the garden store, and he brings back big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes, and then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds, and we put them in all of the boxes, and we water them. And I am not the gardener in the family, so at this point I'm exhausted, and I sit back going to be delighted, right? So about 3 weeks later, I walk out of my front door onto my porch, and as I looked at the flower boxes, I stopped in my tracks, because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were tall, vigorous-looking plants, and other boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly-looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had brought turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted, and the strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, and even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died, and even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And I see some of you out there nodding, so I know there's some gardeners out there. And maybe you've composted half of your garden, and maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes, and the image is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to make this a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So we're going to have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and the pink seed she throws in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later in her garden, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the red seed has sprouted, the strong red seed has grown very tall and vigorous, and even the weak red seed has made it halfway up. While in that poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died, and here comes the strong pink seed struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those two flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, 10 years later, the gardener is looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So the first part of the story, we're going to interrupt the story for just a moment to say the first part of the story is how institutionalized racism works. Where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil, contemporary structural factors keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of the perpetuation of the inequity. But we'll pick the story back up and say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, the gardener is looking over red, thinking red is very beautiful, and then she looks over the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly, so she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red. Many of them not even understanding or acknowledging that they're benefiting from enriched soil. And the pink flowers are looking over at red, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees. And the bees are minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee bzz, into one of the flowers, and into one of the pink flowers, and then bzz, to another pink flower, and then bzz, to this pink flower. That flower's like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism, and we could go over to the pink flowers, and we could say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is it's an important intervention, but if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. So you can say, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop. It's all good. It's all good, it is. So we have our workshop. And in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. I think that if we really want to set things right in this garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means that we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it makes it easier for the gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you keep separate boxes, then what you need to do is to enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious, so that in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, you'll have also addressed the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in that intervention, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in this garden, we need to at least address the institutionalized racism, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But before I leave that story and carry on, I have to say there's one more big question that I have not even raised with you all, and that is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are actually the elements of self-determination. Well, who is the gardener? Government is a huge part of the gardener. Foundations, media, corporations, communities, to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when she is allied with one group. When I have slides behind me, I paint her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, right? When she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And so our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dot or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow and recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions can come out of this story, but we don't have time today. This is not that. This is graduation. So that's my first story. That's my first story. Woo! By something that I saw with my own real eyes, I call dual reality, a restaurant saga. And this one actually happened. The thing that made me think of this story happened when I was a medical student. So I was studying late with some friends in our apartment, and it got late, and we were hungry, and there was no food in the apartment. So we decided to walk into town and find something to eat. So we find a restaurant, and we walk in, and we sit down, and the menus are presented to us, and we order our food, and the food is served, and we're eating. And it's not a very remarkable story yet. I'm hoping that most of us have had that experience once or twice. But as I sat there eating with my friends, I looked across the room, and I noticed a sign, and the sign was a profound revelation to me about racism. So you might say, ooh, what did the sign say? What the sign said was open. Now you're like, Dr. Jones said, it's not very clear yet, so let me make it plain. Here I am, sitting at the table of opportunity eating, and I look across the room and I see a sign that says open. And if I hadn't thought anything more about it, I would assume that other people who were hungry could come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I realized that now, in fact, the restaurant was closed due to the hour, and that hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, and eat. And then I recognized that racism structures open-closed signs. Racism structures a dual reality. And for those on the inside, sitting at the table of opportunity eating, and looking up and seeing a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on. Because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white people in this country to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except we got a little taste of that with Ebola, did we not? Yet those on the outside are very well aware of the two-sided nature of the sign, because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, for those who say, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I acknowledge that it is hard to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, then you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to know that racism exists, to acknowledge it and to try to act on that. It's an empowering thing. It doesn't compel you to act, but it equips you to act. And if you care anything about the people on the other side of that sign, then you might even talk to the restaurant owner and say, because after all, the restaurant owner is inside with you, and you might say, well, why don't you open the restaurant again? There are hungry people outside. Let them come in. You'll make more money, and the conversations we can have. Or maybe you'll pass food through the door, or maybe you'll break down the glass or tear down the sign, but at least what you will not be doing is saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat, because you will understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So with that as my second story, I want to turn now just briefly with our stories. Each of you is going to author your own story. I want you to take that authorship seriously. You are not going to be following somebody else's script. But the other thing that we need to do is you're going to hear lots of stories. You're going to hear patient histories. Actually, I don't know if you realize that or not, but the patient history, their story, is the most important information you'll get from a patient. More important even than a physical exam, and more important than labs. So listen carefully to that patient history, but not just the history of their present illness, but think about their social history. And then be interested in where do they live, and maybe you can be part of doing some home visits. Maybe you can venture into communities that are not your own and learn about their social context. And maybe you can be understanding that we all have to burst through bubbles. We're all in a bubble. You've been in a medical school bubble. It's probably been plexiglass. Like, you can't get through that. It's really hard, right? But we are all in bubbles, going to school, going to work, with our kids or whatever it is, often not knowing that there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, across town or across the world, who live in very different circumstances. So when we talk about stories, don't just be concerned with your own story and authoring. We need to do three things with other people's stories. We need to be interested in the stories of others. We need to believe the stories of others. And then we need to join in the stories of others and act. So before I finish, I just want to say I have been thinking about you for a whole lot, and I have actually handmade origami flowers for each of you.
Oh,
now,
God.
Let me tell you something about that. This is also about your life, okay? So you're about to get a sheet of paper, right? It's going to be maybe some more fancy stuff on it. It's not going to be a flat sheet of paper, but it's a sheet of paper that's going to help you to shape your life. But all of our lives are like flat sheets of paper. And when you have a flat sheet of paper, sometimes you might be upset if it gets a fold in it. And you try to unfold it, and then maybe it gets another fold in it. And then, with all of these folds, then all of a sudden you see, oh, it turns into something nice and organized. And then if you keep following your own path and the unfolds, it will turn into something beautiful. There is a flower for each of you in this basket, so after you get your other paper and you get hooded and all of that stuff, I'd be delighted if you take one of these. If you want to crumple it up tonight, that's all right, but if you want to keep it to talk about what your lives will be, I want you to have lives of joy, purpose, meaning, and I want them to be your own lives. There are no shoulds in this. Follow your own path. You have no idea where you'll be 20 years from now. In fact, you will probably create that thing that you're living. Congratulations for a job well done so far.